So I want to begin. We have lots of questions, not a lot of time. And I'm going to really put you on the spot, Meg, to start. So forgive me. There have been too many high profile cases of police subduing a person with mental illness, resulting in death. Tell us how reporters see their role in getting those stories to the public and how they go about doing that.
Right. Well, thanks so much for that question, Linda. So you're right. I mean, even in yesterday's front page of yesterday's Washington Post, another story about a young man who died at the hands of police, a young man with severe chronic mental illness. And what we have to do as journalists is to stop just that bad feedback loop of reporting it in the same way. And we've got to dig deeper. We've got to get behind that. And we were talking before the panel began about how situations like this is a sorrow on both ends of that equation. It's the person who's been killed by the police and their family, and it's the police officers as well. And I was recalling that the first case of this that I covered, I think it was 30 years ago, was a young man who police shot and killed. The police officer had to be carried away in a ambulance because he was so upset about what happened. So I think as journalists, it's incumbent on us to write about these with all the layers that we can bring to that, the humanity, the empathy, showing these people on all sides of that equation how that came to be, and peel back those layers and don't play into stereotypes. And that's what we talk about in my class all the time, looking beyond the stereotypes to motivations and why these tragedies happen. Why are the police the ones who are the first to be called? Are there not enough hospital beds? We know that there are not. I mean, I could talk the whole hour and I won't. I'll shut up by just saying that that's what we need is to do as journalists, is to tell a much fuller story.
Steve, I think in that discussion we were having, before we opened the panel, you were talking about trauma and police and some of the work you're doing in Miami on that issue.
So we noticed after we started training our officers in CIT that my CIT,
What's CIT? Just
sorry,
tell everybody.
Crisis Intervention Team Policing. It's a 40-hour training program for law enforcement that teaches them how to identify someone who's in a mental health crisis, how to de-escalate the situation, and where to take them as opposed to arresting them. And so we have the largest trained squad in the country. We have over 7,600 officers now trained at all 36 of our departments in Miami-Dade. But we started to notice my coordinator started to get a lot of calls. She gets about 150 calls a month from our police officers for their own personal mental health issues. And what we discovered is that they wouldn't go to their own departments for help for all the obvious reasons. And so what we did is we went to the agencies and said, look, we have a problem here. We need to address it. Would it be okay if we refer these officers to treatment outside the department? And we worked out a way to do that. And it, in my opinion, has made the officers very empathetic. In the last 10 years, our CIT officers have handled well over 105,000 mental health calls and have only made 198 arrests. So we know that there's been this cultural shift in their approach, but trauma is a physiological reaction. It's not an emotional response. It's literally an overdose of cortisol from your pituitary gland from a situation you're witnessing. And so we have a lot of officers that are returning vets coming in with trauma, getting re-traumatized. And we have officers in the department getting traumatized and re-traumatized. Last year, more officers died from suicide in the United States than in the line of duty. And not only do they have very high suicide rates, they have high domestic violence rates, high divorce rates, and it's a
They
very
have guns.
situation. And they have guns, and their identity is often tied up to their job. And so trying to take that away from them becomes a very serious issue, and identifying these issues quickly for them makes a huge difference. But it also makes a huge difference if we would start identifying people in the community with these trauma issues to keep them from ever coming into our system. And let me make one more point and then I'll stop. But We know, for instance, that 92% of all the women in jail and prisons in the United States with serious mental illnesses have very serious histories of trauma, mostly sexual abuse as a child. And about 75% of men in jails and prisons with serious mental illnesses also have very serious trauma. Some of it's sexual abuse, but often it's domestic violence or witnesses to very horrific acts. And a young brain that is overdosed with cortisol is damaged more than an adult brain. And so the schools need to start getting involved at an earlier stage so that we can start identifying these issues and keeping people from ever coming into the criminal system.
Vic, let me turn to you. You're now the leader in North Carolina around mental health, substance use, intellectual disability issues. Can you talk a little bit about how you are thinking about the intersection of the police and people with mental illness, and also the issue of race and structural racism that is very much, I think, on everyone's mind?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think there is some intersectionality among all those things, I think. And I think if you go back to, in part, thinking about what Judge Lightman just shared about the trauma response and realizing that you kind of in having a law enforcement response, in many ways, you already create the perfect storm because you are oftentimes responding to individuals who have experienced trauma, oftentimes at the hands of law enforcement, whether you're talking about someone that has been involuntarily committed, whether you're talking about people of color who have seen disproportionately bad outcomes, particularly for Black and brown males, and then you are having them interact with a law enforcement officer who is trained to respond and to react. And I think part of the challenge, at least from my perspective, and this is one of the things that I'm trying to get us to think about differently in North Carolina, is that the construct of our response to people in a mental health emergency, in my view, is flawed from the beginning. Because first of all, it always strikes me that when someone has a medical emergency, we call it an emergency. When someone has a mental health emergency, we call it a crisis. And the question for me is always, is the person in crisis or is the system in crisis because we don't have the resources to meet their need at the time that they have the need? And when you respond already seeing this as a person in crisis, it already kind of connotes something different, because an emergency response is going to invoke protect and serve. If you're responding to someone trapped in a fire, that's an emergency. A crisis response invokes fight, flight, freeze, or annihilate whatever the threat is. And so when you're responding to someone in crisis, you're already coming with this heightened sense of awareness. If you have trauma in your body and this person that you're encountering has trauma in their body, you've already created that perfect storm. So I think that the basic construct flaw of our crisis response system is that we have a system that is really not designed to protect and nurture the person who's having the mental health emergency. We have a response that's designed to protect the rest of us from the person who's having the mental health emergency. And I think when you combine that with that person also potentially being a person of color, it just creates even more of the perfect storm and creates the potential for a negative outcome.
Just that shift from crisis to emergency is one I will remember. It's a very helpful paradigm change. John, can we go to you? You in many ways run our system that is our first responders in many cases to someone in distress. Can you tell us a little bit about Lifeline and how it relates to warm and hotlines all over the country and how that works? Can you briefly describe it? Because I'm not sure everyone watching us truly understands what's in place now.
Happy to do that, Linda. Thanks. It's a national network of local crisis services, local crisis centers or hotlines that are networked to a single number, which right now is 800-273-8255. So when you call that national number, we then send that call, and we as Vibrant Emotional Health will send that call to the nearest center to the caller typically. And if they're busy for some reason, we can then send it to a national backup center to make sure that all calls are answered. So when counselors receive these calls, they all work at accredited hotlines. They're all trained in crisis intervention. They're all trained in suicide prevention. They're trained in assisting with people, all sorts of levels of crisis, and can provide them not only some opportunities to de-escalate and receive some support, but also provide them with linkages to referrals, including crisis and emergency services as they need.
John, can you describe who your callers are? Are they mostly young? Are they old? Are they Black? Are they white? I mean, just some sense.
So yes, we don't actually collect race and ethnicity, but what information that we do have nationally essentially is about, from a gender standpoint, about 55% of the callers are female, about 45% are male. And then we've got about, I'd say, a little over half, about 57% of the callers are under 35. A third are under 25. So yes, young people do call. They're mostly, about 25% of our callers are looking for help around suicidality, and the rest around, family relationship issues, anxiety, depression. For chat and text, it's a little different. About 2/3 of the users of chat and text are female, and most all of them are young.
I know that. When you are thinking about who calls, and do you have repeat callers, people who want to connect, but they don't necessarily want more than either chatting, texting, or calling?
Absolutely, Linda. There's people that, again, that our system is not necessarily designed to be there for people all the time. And it's also true that when people can't access care so easily, whenever they need issues or have problems at 2 a.m, they can't go to an outpatient clinic, but they can call us. And a number of callers will use our phone lines for emotional regulation. So the moment that they're having a hard time with sleep, or the moment they're having a hard time with a relationship, rather than, or any stress throughout the day, they will check in with us. And so there's a few frequent callers that we do have, and we're actually setting up explicit services for them, because it's really, Linda, this is not a problem with frequent callers. This is our problem. It's not their problem. Our problem is that we have not designed a system to help individuals regulate their emotions and help them manage those. So we're going to be setting up eventually over the next year a frequent caller center that is really designed to provide a different and new service for people who are frequent callers, to help them with the frequent struggles that they're having.
And John, that will be national. It will
Yes.
tie into all the centers that exist.
Absolutely.
Too, Linda, and John touched on something I think very important, and Judge Lightman touched on this earlier, and that is that we have suicide prevention, National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. But the thing I think that we often don't think about is that suicide itself is not the disease, not a disease. It is the worst possible outcome of the culmination of a lot of very complex issues. And what we don't often do is look at ways to get upstream of suicide and get to a person before they reach that point of crisis, and creating a venue where people can call when they're in the early stages, when they're experiencing depression or anxiety and don't quite know what to do with their feelings. That's the time that we need to be intervening. And if we only provide resources that respond once someone has reached crisis, and we don't address the reasons that we can't intervene and don't intervene early in the process, we're going to be forever in a crisis response mode.
But I think that's true of all access to all mental health care, including for people with chronic and severe mental illness, whereas, there at one time used to be more facilities for them. Now there's a lack of these intermediary or community-based places for them to go. So for many people, the default is to just pick up the phone and call 911. There are no places for them to go. So you either end up, in jail, you call a cop. In Wisconsin, where I did the bulk of my reporting, in order to be admitted to the psychiatric hospital and as an emergency detention, you were required to be brought in by a police officer in handcuffs in a squad car. That I don't know of any other form of illness where care is initiated via a police officer.
Well, consider too that, statistically, um, African Americans are 20% more likely to report psychological stressors than are white people. But African Americans are statistically less likely to initiate treatment and more likely to terminate treatment prematurely. And there are a lot of reasons for that. But, I've always hypothesized that part of the reason is we don't have that access to treatment in neighborhoods where people of color live. And if you have to take 3 buses to get to an outpatient appointment, you're much less likely to go to that appointment, and you're much less likely to come back. Which gets us back to kind of to your point, Meg, is that for a lot of people of color, their introduction to the mental health system is in the back of a police car, or at best in an acute care emergency department, because it is when they're in that crisis mode, and that is not conducive to good outcomes, and it's not conducive to building a good relationship with the mental health system.
So, a while back, I think it was in Oregon where it first started, that, mental health or behavioral health staff would ride with police when it was a psychiatric emergency, not crisis. You see, I'm learning. And, now we've really started to say, why should police respond at all? And certainly in New York, I know, Charlene McRae, our First Lady, has worked hard to have several precincts as pilots where the police won't respond. It will be, a behavioral health staff. What are we seeing around the country, and what do we think about that? And I was wondering, Steve, if that's something that you're doing in Miami and how you would view that.
So I think there probably needs to be a hybrid. I don't, these cases sometimes involve weapons and sometimes do involve violence, and you may need some law enforcement there. So I don't think we should just go to one extreme or to another, but I think there's a happy medium. In Houston, they have a program that I like where you call 911. The 911 operator has a validated screening tool if it's a mental health call. And if they determine quickly that a law enforcement officer is not needed, they will then call the provider, stay on the phone until there's a warm handoff, and there'll be a non-law enforcement response. If it's a worse emergency involving some kind of violence, then they may send both out. And we're looking to do some kind of hybrid like that as well, because it's not really even a good use of law enforcement resources if the person should have a non-law enforcement response. Plus, which was already Meg mentioned, even in Florida, if you're taken to a crisis stabilization unit by a law enforcement officer, which is the majority of our cases are by law enforcement, they have to put you in handcuffs in the back of a police car. It's horrifying. I mean, they didn't commit a crime. And we really need to change that mindset. And we do have to move upstream. I mean, the other part of this is these are real illnesses. And we know that the longer people go in psychosis without treatment, the more brain damage there's going to be. So why are we waiting? Why are we waiting decades for people to get treatment? We really need to move upstream. We know how to do it. In fact, the other thing I think we should really start to think about is not just using the phone. I mean, this is 2021. We are in Zoom heaven or hell, depending on the day. But I think we should develop a system where people can see a counselor face-to-face 24/7 on an emergency basis. And I think that would keep people from moving into crisis. And if that counselor who would be trained thinks that it's an emergency and there needs to be a greater intervention, they could call in the backup to go do that. But I think in this day and age, particularly in rural areas that have terrible access to treatment, we should be developing a face-to-face system where people can get access to care 24/7. I think it would reduce police activity, it would reduce emergency room usage, and we would be able to get people in a nice private setting the care they need more quickly.
That's a great plug for our next panel, which is going to be on telehealth. But I just wanted to add this point about Houston as well. They did something very clever many years ago, and that is developed a mental health division within their police department. So not just a small little side department. This is a division of their police department that is dedicated to mental health. And the police officers there, they keep very close tabs on the homeless people that they run up against on their daily beat. And they really give it a full, they collect a lot of data, and they really examine where the population is of people who are on the streets struggling with mental illness. So a big commitment.
We're in the process of doing a big technology piece right now with our Miami-Dade Police Department, our managing entity in the courts, and it's called Dakota. And what we're going to be able to do starting very soon is, right now our CIT officers, and we have divisions also within all the departments, but most of it's done by hand. But we have an electronic platform for arrest affidavits. So we're going to offer every CIT officer throughout the county that when they'll be filling out the form from a mental health call, it will automatically go into this computer system, which will have the ability to tell us who the high utilizers are, which providers they're going to. Remember, in a large urban area, you get one person with a serious mental illness, they may go to 4 or 5 different providers that don't talk to each other, get 4 or 5 different diagnoses, 4 or 5 different medications, case managers, and really they end up getting nothing. And so technology is going to help us figure that out.
Steve, that is perfect. And one of the things I've learned also is the electronic health record companies don't necessarily want providers to talk to each other because they want the business. So there is a business aspect to much of this. When you were talking about the 24/7, and Meg connected it to next month's panel that Dr. Ravi Shah will be moderating for us, looking at the startups, the technology companies that are filling that very space. And I think one of the things he'll look at, so everyone should tune in, is why that is so incentivized fiscally when our providers on the not-for-profit sector don't have those kind of incentives. And so it makes it much more complicated.
We're
and
about
harder
to start a major technological revolution in Dade. We've been offered this new program that's Google driven, and it has predictive analytics. But one of the obstacles that we have to deal with is sometimes the providers get very nervous with that kind of information because it adds a new layer of accountability that people don't always feel is beneficial to them. But we're going to move ahead with it because it's so critically important, and it's going to help eliminate a lot of the duplication and help us figure out who's getting us a better outcome depending on the treatment they're getting, and help us re-educate the entire community.
But I do hope at some point, and maybe it's next month, we will look at the incentives in the private sector versus publicly funded organizations, and how very different that is, and the kind of capital that's raised in for-profit private sector versus no startup dollars in the not-for-profit. But I don't want to be an apologist for providers that are resistant to doing the right thing. So let's go to the next.
Linda, I did want to make just one sort of a pushback, but maybe more of a caveat. I think when we talk about like the hybrid model that maybe we see in Texas, I think the challenge from my perspective is always when you have a system where you make a determination about whether this merits a law enforcement response or not, that subjectivity often results in people of color getting law enforcement called on them. And I think, that's one of the things that I think, even when we're looking at outcomes, we have to look at those kinds of outcomes. Are we getting disproportionately Black and brown people that end up with police escorts, and others that end up with strictly mental health response?
And that speaks to the point John made about the fact that they don't have that data. And if we don't measure it, we won't see that it's a problem. So you're bringing up an important point. When we are doing that and we're deciding police won't go and we're collecting the information, looking back over the last month, we need to have that information because then we can correct.
Absolutely.
Without it, we won't. And I think what you're putting on the table is likely to happen, in fact. So let's talk a little bit about suicide. You know, one of the things, you know, it's a great, you know, gift, you know, that I'm on the National Alliance Executive Committee. But what resonates is how much we talk about young people, which is the right thing to do, but how little we talk about the fact that 70% of deaths by suicide are men. And, you know, not young people, although young people is a tremendous loss and trauma, and that half of all deaths by suicide are guns. And so when we talk about this overrepresentation of men, of people with guns, maybe police histories of being in the military, do we have to have a different approach for them? And do we have any thoughts about how we should be thinking about that and perhaps tailoring some of our interventions? And I was wondering, maybe John or Vic or Steve or Meg, any of you have ideas about that?
Well, you know, one of the issues clearly is that there's a belief that we should know how to take care of ourselves. That men, we can fix it, and if we can't fix it, no one can. And we have got to kind of disavow that notion and provide people with models that say, essentially, there's a lot of people that can't figure it out, that won't figure it out, and need help. You know, one of the things that we were talking earlier about in terms of you know, people just respond only when they're in crisis. It's because they don't know what mental health looks like. It's not the absence of mental illness. That isn't what mental health is. We need to teach people, including men, what that looks like. And that really requires a lot of storytelling, not just data. We can provide data, but I think men need more models that say, here's my mental health struggles. This is where I was at one time doing really well. I'm not doing well now. In fact, I lost my job. I lost my marriage. I'm now thinking about killing myself. And then the story of how they recover is very important. Now we know that for every one person who dies by suicide, there's about 280 other people who think seriously about suicide but don't kill themselves. A lot of those are men. And those are untold stories of suicide prevention who don't tell you how they got out of that. And what we know is when we tell those stories, research has shown, it can actually reduce the suicide rate. People listen to that. They can relate to that individual. It's a model that helps them instruct. And I think we need to have a lot more intentional models that are created specifically for men. Focus group with men. In Australia, in fact, there was I was talking with some folks who were talking about telemedicine earlier, that they found that actually teleconferencing with men was more effective for some reason. We used to think that things like chat and digital chat, text might be better for men because they'd be more anonymous. It's not true. It's actually better for women, but actually maybe something about a connection with somebody they can look at and can help them feel comfortable and safe and develop a sense of trust might then help them bridge to treatment. And that's what they found in Australia. So maybe more of the teleconferencing things that Steve were talking about, maybe some of those Zoom-like innovations could really make a difference for men. And we need to test that out.
You know, that makes a lot of sense to me, because I know that part of the challenge with men is teaching men, first of all, it's okay to be vulnerable, and then teaching them how to sit with that and be okay with that and share that, and then creating safe space for men to be able to talk about the feelings that they're having. And I'll tell you from my own personal experience, I remember back last summer when we were looking at the deaths of George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor, and it was a really difficult time for me, and not really knowing what to do with all of that, the not just pain, but just anger. But one of the things that helped me was reaching out to white male friends because what I really needed was to see the world as a safer place and not feel so alone, and that, you know, men of color in particular were not welcome in America. And one of the things that was very therapeutic for me was reaching out to some white male friends and just connecting with them and talking about, you know, this is, and I had some that reached out to me and said, just checking to see how you're doing. But having that space to be vulnerable and say, you know, this is hard, and then sharing with them, and them also sharing with me that it was okay for me to feel that way. They couldn't completely relate to it, but they were there, you know, to help me deal with that, was extremely helpful. And I think we got to create more experiences like that for men to be able to share, I think.
So kind of expanding on that and continuing with the theme of this panel on crime and people with mental illness, is one of my students reflecting on the panel today made this great observation. She said that when she was in high school and they brought in somebody who had been paralyzed in a drunk driving accident, talking about, you know, kind of scaring them straight. And she said, what if you got police officers, you know, to volunteer or to work at a psych hospital and get to know, you know, people with severe mental illness on a personal level. It means crisis intervention training does a measure of that. But I think that that's at the heart of this, is the otherness, you know, by police officers and their views of people with mental illness, and the other way around too. So again, not to get all kumbaya on everybody, but I do think the more kind of engendering of understanding people on a human level, then you're not going to have a police officer just assume that this guy staggering down the street in a psychiatric episode or a psychotic episode is a bad person or evil, or that the cop is there to hurt them. So I pray for the day that we figure out a way to bring that kind of level of understanding. I don't know how you do it, and especially in big cities or any place, but that's what I think would be helpful.
So in 2022, we're going to have a new telephone number, right? 988 for psychiatric emergencies, people in emotional distress. John, you're really very much in the thick of things in terms of working with states as they think about, okay, we have a number. How do we get it up and running? How do we pay for it? And then what do we need behind it? What kinds of services and responses do we need? What are people thinking about? And then maybe Vic, you can talk a little bit about how you're thinking about it in North Carolina. Is this an opportunity? And could you describe the promise? And maybe Meg can remind us of some of the dangers.
Yeah, I'm going to want to hear about that from you, Vic, because we're working very closely with the states. And for the listeners and viewers who aren't familiar with this 988 thing, it's basically a 3-digit number that both the FCC is assigned to the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, SAMHSA, and the Department of Health and Human Services to become a national mental health and suicide hotline service for everybody. Again, a 3-digit number, thinking that it's going to be easier for people to remember and easier to dial in a crisis. It's an extraordinary thing because it's now 911 is a very separate entity. Then now we have one specifically for psychological emergencies, which is an opportunity to really bust stigma. But when the National Suicide Hotline Designation Act was passed in October and became law in October, there wasn't any funding that was provided through that act. What was provided was a clause that allowed states, if they wanted to basically tax or levy a fee on cell phone carriers to be able to fund 988 services like we do 911. And they could make that choice or not. They've also the act also required SAMHSA and the VA to provide a report in April, in just a few months, that will detail what the infrastructure needs are for 988. So perhaps that will give us some clues and cues as to what's needed from a financial standpoint. But right now, there is no significant funding in any way that has been set aside to that we would say is sufficient for 988 services, both locally and nationally. So we've been working with states. Vibrant recently put out about $10 million worth of grants to all states to help us work with each one of them to plan what it is that we're going to do for 988, because a lot of states don't have the time or resources to do the planning necessary, but if we're giving them funds to set aside that time and giving them technical assistance and tools to do that planning for roughly the next 8 months, we should all be coming away at the end of this year with a plan, a roadmap for building this alternative to 911 for people who are having psychological crises. So Vic, I'd love to hear what your thoughts are and where North Carolina is with this.
After Nick does that, John, can we go back and talk about the 5% set aside in the block grant for crisis services and the pending really legislation in Congress around funding and your optimism or pessimism about will that be enough? But go ahead, Vic.
Well, so I'm sorry, Vic, do you want to talk about
no, go ahead, because I want to hear your thoughts on the 5% set aside. So go ahead.
It's a great idea, Vic. It's basically a foot in the door. It's $35 million for the states is really what it comes down to, which means in California, you might have maybe $2 or $3 million for crisis services. In Wyoming, you might have 50,000. It's not much. But what it does is create a precedent through which, if the federal government did want to provide significant funding for the services, they would have a conduit for doing so, and that's what makes it really important. But Vic, tell us what your thinking is on.
Yeah, and we think for us the 5% set aside is roughly $1 million. So, so we're thinking about a number of different things. Linda, you touched on two of the biggest things that we have to figure out. One is, what kind of services do we need? If we're going to create a response to folks in a mental health emergency, what kind of services do we need? And then how do we pay for it? And the things we're looking at in terms of the services that we need, we know there are some components that in theory would work well. Like we know mobile crisis, some kind of a mobile crisis response needs to be a piece of that, but it can't be the mobile crisis response that we currently have, where we have a 2-hour window for them to respond. Because that looks very different from a 911 response where people are able to, where help is able to be there immediately. So we're having to rethink, not just the service array, but what the components of those services look like. What it also is causing us or giving us an opportunity to do is to look at what components of a mental health response do we currently have across the state. What do we have that's mobile? What do we have that's stable? What do we have stationary? What do we have in the rural communities? What do we have in the urban communities? And then what would it look like to try to weave something together that looks at least similar across the state? And North Carolina is a state that has a lot of rural communities. So part of the challenge we have there is we know that we not only have to have a shift in resources, but we have to have a culture shift. You know, I shared early on in this conversation that part of the flaw, as I see it in our system now, is that when we respond, in particular with the law enforcement response, the mindset is that individual is dangerous, and you've got to protect other folks from this person who is irrational in their thinking, who's disorganized in their thinking, and who is unpredictable. And so I've got to come on site and neutralize that person. And for a lot of communities, that's going to be a hard mindset to shift. And when we built around that 911 response, we've got to also change their culture. So where we're thinking now is that we will probably end up piloting a couple of things first, and piloting something in a rural community, piloting something in an urban community, and trying to build the model that we feel like we need, as opposed to sparsely doing something across the state that looks similar in some places to what we need and nothing like what we need in other places. So we're trying to create something that we can then also scale, and also go back to our legislature and say, we think this is the right response. Here's where we see the cost savings in it. Here's where it saves on a law enforcement response. Here's where it saves on people ending up in the court system. And so we think there's an opportunity to really reimagine and rethink our approach to how we respond to people that are experiencing a mental health emergency.
Could I ask, I'm sorry to interject, Linda, but I was fascinated before the panel began. Steve was telling us a little bit about the diversion court, and just in the way of keeping with the theme of solutions and
Mhm.
talking about like mental illness not being a crime. So Steve, can you talk a little bit about the success that your program has had and in diverting people away from the criminal justice system?
And the components of it. It was actually my next question, Meg, so it's perfect. And is it
That's
being
why she's a journalist, Linda.
right? It's right. And is it being replicated anywhere? And how do we help spread the information, Steve? So
Thank you both for the plug. So, the criminal justice system is a repository of failed public policies, and there is no greater failed public policy than our treatment towards people with serious mental illnesses. It's not that we have a criminal justice problem, we have a structural mental health problem. We keep using this word system. There really isn't a great system of care. It's not that we don't spend money. We just spend it in all the wrong places. It's spent in hospitalization, it's spent in jail, it's spent in competency restoration, which is more than we spend on the treatment side. Dade County, for instance, spends $636,000 a day. That's $232 million a year to treat people in its jail, 2,400 people in its jail with serious mental illnesses. It's absurd. And so what we've done here, which has shrunk that number, has got us down to 2,400, is we set up a two-part system, which I believe needs to be a three-part system. And the two-part system is a pre-arrest diversion system. And that is massive training of law enforcement. We have over 7,600 officers trained. It's the largest trained squad in the country. All 36 departments are trained, but we also have a separate 9/11 call taker training program at 16 hours. We have a separate 5-hour training for the police chiefs and their majors on how to run it. We have recurring training, and we have liaisons at every single police department that meet with our providers on a quarterly basis. And so they'll come in and say, hey, I've been to Steve Leifman's house 6 times this quarter. He's not getting what he needs. It empowers the police, and a mobile crisis may go out, and we're going to elevate a situation before it gets bad. We also have a post, and so what the law enforcement officers do basically is they do an amazing job of not arresting. So we keep a lot of data on the 2 largest departments. I just mentioned we're going to extend that to all departments in the next year. But we know out of 105,000 mental health calls over the last 10 years, the police only made 198 arrests. So the number of arrests in Dade County pre-COVID went from 118,000 a year to 53,000. It's startling. Our police shootings almost stopped as well. And so there's just been all this very good positive change just by training law enforcement appropriately. We also set up a post-arrest diversion system. We changed the screening tools in the jail. And so if you're identified as having a serious mental illness and meeting the diagnostic criteria that we work off of, and you're arrested on a misdemeanor, within 3 days of your arrest, if you meet criteria for involuntary commitment, you are physically moved from the jail to one of our crisis stabilization units. And because they're on a criminal hold, we hold them up to 2 weeks. So the 72 hours doesn't apply because of the criminal case, which is what most people actually need. We then send our team to go meet with them. And then if they agree to come to the program, which most people do, we do not rebook them into the jail.
But the part, I'm sorry to interrupt, but the pre-arrest, how do you get somebody into treatment before you arrest them?
So they are taken directly to a crisis stabilization unit if the officer who's trained believes they meet the criteria. And if not, the officer has all kinds of resources to give the family and to the individual. They may not need crisis care. They may just need a referral to a treatment center. And we have all the data on who's getting sent and how it's working.
Are there enough places to abide the treatment, the demand for the treatment?
One good thing Florida does have, even though we're 49th per capita in funding, is we do have a lot of crisis stabilization units, both public and private. And when we put this arrangement together in 2000, we actually did a written collaborative agreement, and both the private and the public providers signed on to this. So they, yes, will go to all these. Now, let me finish this, and I'm going to tell you what we're about to do next because it's going to change everything. So we have the post-arrest. And if they agree to come into the program, they're taken back to court, not to jail. When they get to court, there's a peer waiting for them with food, with clothes, with their medication. The county gave us a car so we can transport them. We've arranged their housing. We've arranged for their benefits to be turned on. And we will work with them as much and as often as we need to help keep them out from reoffending. And it works. And they
That's
do.
like Dorothy from the Wizard of Oz. You like give them everything. It's awesome.
We do. It's common sense. It's not that hard. And it's a lot cheaper than incarcerating people or having them go to a hospital. And remember, the other thing we're not even talking about today, a large percentage of this population has primary health needs because they don't get cared for in the community either. And they cost hundreds of millions of dollars because they have no insurance. So we help with all of that by keeping them out of these deep-ended acute systems. And once they successfully complete the terms of the program, in most cases, the charges are dropped and they're not adjudicated, because once they're adjudicated, it's harder to get a job, it's harder to get a housing. And so we want to keep them out of the system. The next piece we're about to do, and we're halfway done building it, is we're renovating this 181,000 square foot facility. And it's going to be the first of its kind in the United States. It's going to be a diversion facility. It's 7 stories, and it's going to be both, it's going to be what we call a medical home. So it'll have primary health and psychiatric services in one place. And so there'll be a crisis stabilization unit, a short-term residential, 200 beds of housing. There'll be a day activity program for people to have housing and to get day activities. There'll be a culinary supportive employment program to help people get employment. There'll be a primary clinic, a dental clinic, an eye clinic, and trauma services.
Is this all voluntary?
Yes and no, it'll be both.
Okay.
So depending on what criteria they meet when they come in, but the idea is, instead of just adjudicating people and kicking them to the curb that are acutely ill, we can gently reintegrate people back into the community in recovery with services that they need. Once they get past and they're stable, then it becomes voluntary. And others can come in and stay voluntary. But again, it's for the most acutely ill. Our current system is capable of taking care of people that aren't that sick.
Right.
But there's nothing in the country for the people that are so acutely ill and they just keep recycling through the deep end. This facility is intended to break that cycle.
So they begin by a court order or being compelled into treatment?
Not necessarily. So they can get there one of two ways, because it's a great question. We didn't want to incentivize arrests to get this level of treatment, right? You don't want to do that. So you can come in two ways. You can come in through a crisis call where you would have been dropped off to a crisis system. There'll be an assessment done. And if you're a high utilizer and you meet the high criteria, you get to stay. Or if you've been arrested and you meet the high criteria, high utilizer criteria, you also will be sent to this facility. And we can probably see a couple thousand people a year and really kind of get, we only have about 1,000 homeless people left in Dade County. And so that group are mostly the untreated that we haven't been able to help. And so if we can focus our resources and really get the level of care that these individuals need and deserve, we think we'll be able to break this really difficult cycle.
So, you're talking about Miami-Dade County, right? And that is like a New York City, right? It's an area, it's a community, in fact, which I think is where we have to really look at the community level. And I'm just wondering, we hardly have any time left. If in the time left, John, if you or Vic have other examples that people who are posting questions can look to in other parts of the country that are putting together the pieces for a real emergency system that gives people what they need. And I'm afraid we're not going to have time to get to a host of other questions, so we can focus on that.
I can give a few pretty stellar examples of what you're referring to. Probably the largest metropolitan crisis care system that's been heavily invested in and is doing a lot of this mobile dispatch and using crisis respite services is New York City Well, which is part of the NYC Thrive program. And it's having significant success. But what we're really seeing a lot of data come out of what's occurred in Georgia, as well as in Arizona. Now in Georgia, and the Georgia Crisis and Access Line, when they first started off in Atlanta, Fulton County area, when they compared using mobile crisis outreach in that area to all the other counties where they weren't using mobile crisis, they were seeing 4 times the number of police encounters in those other counties. And that's when they said, we've got to do something. And so they made it a statewide line and have reduced the number of police encounters significantly. Likewise, you were talking, Steve, about crisis stabilization units. Those crisis stabilization units in Arizona are part of the Arizona system. And particularly in Maricopa County, they've seen huge dividends just in that county alone. The amount of time of keeping police out of the lives of individuals by just dropping them off at the stabilization unit rather than sitting in an emergency department with them and only spending minutes with them has actually created 37 more police officer FTEs available for the entire year. So that's just Maricopa County alone. And then the savings in healthcare costs have been about $260 million in 1 year alone, just because they've kept people out of emergency departments and hospitals. So the more we can keep people in the communities for these very brief amounts of times and get these kinds of interventions in ways that people want it in their homes, in their lives, without carting them off to the hospital, without bringing in the police, is really the kind of system we need to build.
Well said. Can I ask a final question to you, Steve? And it's about the Equitas project.
Mhm.
Am I saying it right?
Yes, you are. Thank you.
It's
So-
like a stealth project, by the way. Not many people know that it's going on, but it touches on a point Meg has repeatedly gone back to, which is about inpatient beds
right.
and commitment.
So most of the civil commitment laws in the United States are 50 years old. They haven't been modernized. They do not always reflect the science and the research in medicine. And so we brought together a group of really brilliant, thoughtful experts to see if there was a way, how do we make sure we're protecting people's individual civil rights, and at the same time, we're making sure they get the level of care they need so they don't end up in the criminal justice system. So we're at a point now where we have some proposals that we are sending around for comment right now. And we're hopeful that in another month or two, we'll have something that we can begin to get ready to publish that we think will be more reflective of what's needed today. It's not like, oh, we need to hospitalize and, force treatment on everybody, but how do we make sure the science and research, look, we know today in the brain that long-term psychosis, there's really damage to brain matter that's not coming back. And so if we wait too long, we're creating this permanent class of individuals that are going to be going through these systems for life. And we don't want to see that happen. And how do we use the civil system as opposed to the criminal system to make sure that people are getting treated when they need it? But I also, and part of this is reflective, we want people to voluntarily take treatment first. That is number one goal on all of this. We know that when they do, they get better outcomes. But there is a narrow group of people we have not been able to get to, and we want to make sure that the laws reflect the science.
And that's rolling out when, Steve?
Sometime this year. It's out for comment right now, and once we get comments back, we'll meet again, and hopefully in the next 3 to 6 months we can publish something.
Where can we learn more about it? Is there discussion, public discussion on this?
Not really yet. And we've done it purposely so that we didn't have to deal with the politics, and we could just be in a room and talk. And because people are very.
Oh yeah, it's a contentious issue. It's the
It
third
is.
rail of mental.
Nick, it's a scoop.
Yeah.
And so we're being, and we have great doctors and the leading lawyers in the country in the field on it. And Dr. Lieberman from Columbia and Dr. Haug have been helping us as well. And we've been very thoughtful about it, and it hasn't gotten into a fight. We're looking at the science that's there, and there's still a lack of science, to be candid, in some of the areas. We're looking where the laws are, and we're trying to craft it that it doesn't overreach, but it does help individuals that aren't getting the help that they need.
That
Well-
Really needs an upgrade. Yeah.
We are going to have to wrap this up. You mentioned, the project, and we have faculty working on that project, I believe, in addition to you, Steve. And I also want to put in a thanks for Dr. Lieberman, our chair, and his support really of these panels, as well as you, Meg, and your boss at the J School.
Nicole, yeah.
So
Shout out.
we have lots of questions. We will be going through them, getting back to people, and we also hope to have more conversations like this. So let me thank our guests. You were all as fabulous as I knew you would be. And I look forward, to talking with all of you again and to making progress in an area that's very ripe for it, where we have tremendous commitment to do better because we know better. So thank you all very much.